Welcome to this episode of Crossing Barriers, Building Friendships, a podcast of Peace Lutheran Church from Spring Hill, Tennessee. Our guest today is Dr. Mark McEntire, who is a professor of biblical studies at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Welcome, Mark. We're delighted that you're here.
Thank you.
So I've been studying a lot in the Gospel of John and how Jesus is always pushing up against the religious leaders of the time. And it kind of reminded me of your top 20 list of the things that we as Christians do wrong.
The way I characterized these was naming bad ideas from my religious tradition. And I, the caveat I want to add to that is that these have turned out in some ways to be bad ideas for me. I'm not necessarily saying they're bad ideas for everybody, but one of the things I'm concerned about is that we, in this fits your barriers thing, we construct a lot of stuff and end up with a big long list of things that everybody's supposed to believe. And some of them kind of holding up the others, and we get a little bit afraid if we jiggle one of them, the whole thing kind of falls in. And so I'm trying to think about faith not as believing a big long list of stuff or some giant structure of propositions, and so that's what I'm trying to do here. And probably on the most serious side of this is that some of these are ideas that I think quite a few people find to be manipulative or even abusive, and that is the concerning thing. That these ideas have perhaps been used to control people or make them feel, at least to make them feel bad or worse about themselves. So
I noticed that Jesus often calls bullshit on the religious structures of his time. And so I think that we kind of need to take a close look at the ways that we're doing that now. So go ahead, tell us your first one.
Well, my first one is God is your imaginary friend whom you should love more than your own family members. I can remember this one from my youth, people wearing, this will date me a little bit, wearing those buttons and t-shirts that would say, I am third, God is first and others are second and I am third. And, the whole notion is if we're talking about things that we love, I just don't think we ought to rank them. That's the whole, to me, the whole problem with that. Why are we ranking things, right? Why can't we just, love God, love ourselves, love other people, and not try to figure out which one's the most? In fact, maybe even love doesn't do ranking. Might be a thing to say there.
Or that love is not scarce. I mean, parents figure that out. They love child number one immensely, but when child number two comes along, they found out they have enough love for both children.
For both, and they don't rank them, at least not in a healthy situation.
Yes, exactly. Good. Okay, so what's number two?
Number two, it says all humans are terrible and deserve to be tortured forever. So
I hate this.
This is one that I find increasingly common among my students. I'll have this belief that that everybody's horrible like this and deserves terrible treatment, and so should be grateful and gracious if they get anything but that. And I mean, you and I, I'm sure both know plenty of people that we know are not horrible people, don't deserve to be tortured forever. So we end up making this kind of one of the foundations of our understanding of salvation is that the thing we are saved from is some, deserving to be treated badly, even tortured and tormented. And we're getting saved from that.
So, well, I want to go back. So I'm thinking about when you're saying being tortured forever, you've never said the word hell. Is that kind of
right.
what you...
Well, it's certainly, hell involves that, the notion of eternal damnation as something we all just naturally deserve, right? And that's what we should be afraid of and be trying to avoid. And I just find that idea inconsistent with my own experience of people that I've known too many people that don't deserve that.
So what would be another way of coming at that?
Mhm.
Instead of hell, what? Or no hell at all? Or hell exists on earth? Why want it for people in the afterlife?
It's a thing that I don't that I'm not really too concerned about. Whatever is out there is, and what I think about it isn't going to change what is or what isn't. I do think we need to acknowledge that for many people, through no fault of their own, life here on earth has been hell. And certainly those people don't deserve the same thing all over again or worse. And so I just think that whole dichotomy is not helpful to me and is not helpful to a lot of people that I know. So I'm not, I don't have highly developed ideas to replace it. And in fact, I don't have highly developed ideas to replace a lot of these, because part of what I'm doing is not trying to build an alternative structure of other ideas, but to say, why do we need these at all? Can we make the life of faith about something other than a bunch of things that we check off that we believe?
I am a little surprised that you mentioned that your students, which I'm assuming they're 20 somethings or thereabouts, especially think this. I was thinking that would be something that they would call bullshit on.
Yeah, well, I probably should say somewhat selective. And the influence right now, certainly where I teach among students who are Christians, the strongest theological influence is a very heavy Reformed tradition. And this is kind of the standard of that, is this notion of humans as depraved. there's Calvin's language on that. So that kind of is the starting point of their whole understanding of life is human depravity.
Yeah.
I don't know if they do they really think their mothers are depraved? All of them. So.
All right. So what's number 3?
This is kind of the thing that one of the things I was always told growing up. I was unhappy before I trusted Jesus. Therefore, all other people are unhappy until they trust Jesus. I found out just meeting other people that there were plenty of people out there who were plenty happy with their lives, that Jesus didn't have anything to do with it. And so this whole idea that we're all fine inside the Jesus group, right? And everybody else out there is miserable and unhappy didn't ring true on either side of that fence, right? And so it's one of those things that I kind of heard said that just as I grew up continued to fit my experience less and less. The thing that I added on to that is just, don't universalize your experience, right? There probably have been people who were unhappy and then somehow in the process of discovering Jesus, got happier, but it doesn't mean that it works that way for everybody, right? But we all tend to universalize our own experience in a lot of ways like that.
So just let me play devil's advocate for a minute. I'm going to oversimplify Ecclesiastes, and in my kind of take on him, he says, basically it's all vanity, it's all vapors. But if you go through life with someone and have faith in something and have faith that life for him anyway, was better. And so I was studying Ecclesiastes, and then I heard this series about banking, especially in the housing crash of 2008, 10 years later. And they likened it that if people have faith in the banking system, then the banking system works better. But when none of us have faith in the banking system, everybody pulls their money out and the whole system collapses.
Yeah.
And so let me just throw that out there and see how you would respond to that. Or are you just talking about the trusting Jesus thing?
Yeah, and I'm not, it doesn't mean you can't be happy trusting Jesus. It's just not the only way that anybody's ever found to do that. So, for the writer of Ecclesiastes, his experience is, I can take it as true for him. But I mean, part of that, his being happy was not trying so hard, but just taking things as they come, being satisfied with what were relatively simple things. He was food and drink and companionship, and those sorts of things were what he was looking for and finding satisfaction in, rather than striving for what was success in his world.
So the fourth one is God's will for your life, and you have that in quotation marks, is a super secret hidden treasure out there, and you must struggle to find it. So
this was the big deal when I was in college. We were all worried about what God's will for us was.
Isn't that the truth?
And there it was kind of a vocational thing, that God had decided what your job should be your whole life, but was keeping it a secret, and you somehow needed to figure it out. And if you got it wrong, then things were going to be terrible for you. This is. I like Parker Palmer on a lot of this stuff. His idea that your identity and your true vocation and those things are really there inside you. They're part of who you are. And so, if we want to talk about God's will, that's okay. But I think God's will is that I be me, and who I am is a thing for me to figure out, but it's not out there somewhere for me to find. It's not being kept a secret from me, but it's a matter of self-discovery and finding what is satisfying for us.
Well, not only what is it often used in terms of careers, but also who you're supposed to marry. Yes, that God has already chosen a lifelong partner for you, and you're supposed to find that person too. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So what's number 5?
The only reason to be friends with someone who does not have the same faith as you is so that someday you will have a chance to convince them to believe just like you. This was I don't like using the word non-Christian. I try to avoid that. I don't like naming somebody by what they're not. I'm not a non-Muslim. I don't think that says enough about me to be a name or a label for me. But we used that word a lot when I was growing up, and we would think about our friends in the categories of Christian friends and non-Christian friends, right? And your non-Christian friends were always sort of targets to try to convince to believe like you. I learned when I put this one on social media, people responded. I've never heard of that. There was something called missionary dating, that people would date somebody in order to try to convert them, or at least that was their excuse for why they were dating them, But anyway.
So I have to confess, I've been guilty of this one. So
yeah. I found a lot of freedom in my life when I quit putting people in categories and just had friends, and everybody could be who they were. And some were more like me than others, and We could talk about the things that were alike about us, and we could talk about the things that were different. And I wasn't worrying about categories anymore.
Yeah. What a great way to cross barriers and build
Yes.
friendships. So, let's talk about this one about if you're suffering. There are two possibilities. What are those?
Well, and actually that kind of takes the next, I did three that were together. I knew at the beginning it was going to take a while. So I think I spent at least three, numbers 6, 7, and 8 were on that. And first was, if you're suffering, there were two possibilities. Either you sinned and God is punishing you, or that God is testing your loyalty with some kind of pain. And you've got to figure out which one it is. So if it's the first one, then you've got to repent and do some. But if it's the second one, then you've got to persevere. And again, that's a kind of God's will guessing game that I don't think is, isn't for me a healthy way to think about suffering. So on the second one, the problem with that one is that it kind of sounds like an abusive relationship, right? That somebody wants you to behave a particular way, and they're going to punish you until you do. And that's an understanding of God that at least some people I know find quite traumatizing and anxiety creating, that they're being coerced or even pummeled into acting in a certain way. So both of those, I think, end up being problematic. That it's always got to be the assumption behind both of them that God is causing the suffering either way, right? And it can have those two wildly divergent purposes, and you need to somehow decide what those are. And so life is hard sometimes, and everybody endures suffering of some kind, some a lot more than me. And I think the response to that needs to be other things rather than either God is punishing you or God is trying to refine you in some way, right?
So I want to play.
You can find both those ideas in the Bible, no problem. You can find what you want there, but you can find other ideas, I think, as well. So.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to play devil's advocate and say, with the Israelites, and they were no longer following God's ways, and then they were conquered by surrounding countries and stuff. Yeah. That seems to be a whole story of God chastising God's people.
And it never really worked. That's probably my biggest problem with it. It's happened over and over and over again, and it never really worked. And so, one of the things I think about the Old Testament is that the books of the Bible as we have them in their completed form are post-traumatic pieces of literature. They were developed after Israel had lost their land and been destroyed as a nation. So they're dealing with that trauma. Some of what's contained within them, the older traditions, are pre-trauma. But part of what the books do is reprocess that pre-trauma stuff into a post-trauma experience. And so you can still isolate those pieces that are kind of pre-trauma. Prophets telling people, God is angry at you and is going to punish you if you don't straighten up. Well, after you've lost everything, how is that helpful anymore, right? But I think they've reshaped and redeveloped those ideas in ways that address survivors of the trauma of war and defeat, rather than people that are living before that happened. They don't throw their old traditions away. That's the amazing thing. Even when they don't address their needs anymore, they rework them. So.
So I love number 9. You and I are both former Baptists, and so all
Yeah.
about the revivals and the number of people coming down the aisle. So
Yes. And part of this is that that experience of too many revivalist type meetings when everything was focused on how many people came down the aisle at the end of the service. That's all that really mattered. And you start to look at all of these things and you realize all these things are trying to drive people down the aisle. And so they work in that way.
So as now a Lutheran, more we don't do the whole invitation thing. So it's not so much to drive people down the aisle, but it certainly is to drive people into the doors of the church.
Yeah.
And so what should we do? What should we be doing instead?
I'm not as good at that question,
Neither am I.
Because I certainly I think we should be doing less in terms of developing lists of ideas or things that we believe. What I look for and find in church is being part of a community, and then also being part of a community that looks outward to the community around it and asks, what do they need from us? Not so that we can get them to believe like we do, but just simply, what do they need from us? Because that's what we should do, and that's what we want to do, is help the community around us.
I'm reminded of a couple of things in relation to the Nicene Creed. Constantinople wanted the church to unify his empire. And so he got all these bishops together and said, come up with a creedal statement. And they fought and fought and fought. And finally, I was told, simplified version, they barricaded all the bishops in and stopped feeding them before they finally came up with an agreement. And then it's super, super short when you think about it. There's not a whole lot there that they agreed upon in the Nicene Creed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you're laughing at me. Do I have that wrong? You're the professor.
Oh, no, I've not. I don't know if I've ever heard that whole story. I like that. I knew they met and all that stuff. I hadn't heard the part about them not being fed, but yeah.
All right. So our lives are divided. Oh, I like this one too. Our lives are divided into physical and spiritual dimensions. Physical is always secondary.
Yeah. And so, that, again, kind of the way church, the thing that got me about this was, I was always hearing this growing up, but the people that I knew and admired, even in the church, didn't really live this way. They enjoyed life. They enjoyed other people. They enjoyed eating together, all of those things. And so, just more and more as I grew up, I thought, why are we dividing that stuff up? How in the world is having a safe place to live not a spiritual thing?
Well, I would take that as a step further, that the physical is not only second, but that it's often sinful and evil. Mm-hmm. Paul often kind of differentiates stuff that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I've been guilty of this one too. Shoot, you've just been ringing my bell this afternoon, Mark. The only reason to address people's material needs is to get a foot in the door to talk to them about spiritual stuff.
This is the old Baptist missionary thing, and again, the best of the people that I knew really didn't act this way, but others, they talked this way. The reason that we, are feeding people or running a hospital or so became about wanting to plant churches, and that became kind of the driving model in Baptist missions was the only thing that really counted, was how many new churches were there, and simply helping people who were sick, feeding people who were hungry in and of itself had no ultimate meaning. And again, that gets back to the spiritual and physical divide, and the manipulativeness of it as well is just bothersome. I take study abroad groups from Belmont these days, mostly to the Middle East, but I've done our trip to Africa a couple of times. And one time we were involved for a while in Africa with a church group there that, was helping us a little bit to find some projects to do. But they took us to their center for homeless people, and our students. This was one of the places I was proud of our students, because they made these homeless people sit and listen to a sermon before they fed them lunch, and didn't let the people who hadn't been there for the sermon come in and eat, and our students just went nuts. It just went nuts. How can you treat people that way? But to the people that were doing it, it seemed perfectly natural. And I had seen that kind of mentality before. So that whole exchanging thing is one I've been trying to get rid of in my head. Well, number 12 and 13 both have to do with the whole second coming thing. And this was, again, dating myself a little bit. I can remember at a youth event watching that Thief in the Night movie.
Oh, yes. No.
And all of this stuff that was done to kind of keep us terrified. I guess I went through a few years in my life where I really was thinking that, the world's going to end tonight or tomorrow, and it can be kind of scary. So I've got two that I did on that. And the second one is the whole rapture notion, that got tangled up in the Left Behind series. So I've talked to so many people who've had that experience, particularly when they were kids, and they've been told this idea. And if they found themselves in a place where some people they expected to be there weren't there, right? Then suddenly they were afraid that they had been left behind. And I've just talked to a lot of people who actually had that experience, when they were 10 or 11 years old. Imagine what that does to you, to be thinking, oh, my whole family got taken and I didn't.
Well, and I think about
God did that to me.
Yes. Well, and I think about all through history, Christians have never been removed by God from persecution. I mean, like in a raptured sort of way. I mean, that has never, ever, ever happened. So,
yeah.
What about number 14?
Okay, I can take 14 and 15 together, maybe, because here's where I got a little more specific about the Bible. So the first one says the Bible provides answers to life's questions and problems. And this is a common way that people read the Bible that I find to be sort of unworkable, that solutions to problems that people were discovering 3,000 years ago still work now. And so, my shift on that, and I do have a replacement for this.
Okay.
That I think what the Bible helps us do is understand the questions better. We enter into a conversation. And the fortunate thing about it is it's a conversation that's been going on for 3,000 years on questions that I think are really important. The answers, I think, change with time and culture and all of that stuff. But people were asking questions about identity, right? How do we understand ourselves? How do we understand other people that are like us and other people that are different from us? The Bible's full of stories that are asking that kind of question, not necessarily providing a helpful answer to us, but we can hear other people's answers. And then we've got an ongoing dialogue as people have been reading the Bible for 2,500 years about those questions. And we're invited to join that conversation and to use it to figure out our own answers rather than digging around for answers that somebody had a long time ago. The issue of violence, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I always like to say that the Bible is not a history book or a science book. It's a relationship book. And I think that's kind of what you alluded to. Yeah.
So yeah, the issue of violence is the one I addressed specifically in number 15. And I don't think the Bible has any good answer to that. We can connect with it because our experience includes issues of violence as well. Some ways of reading the Bible, of course, generate more violence. I'm interested in trying to reduce that. So we do need to avoid what I say in number 15. This is a common thread that that violence in the Bible is in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament, and it's just not true. You find violence and nonviolence in both.
Well, the crucifixion of Jesus is incredibly violent to me.
The violent story, and Revelation, the end of the world, is an extremely violent story.
That too.
And a whole lot of Jesus preaching, particularly toward the end of his life, is all about separating people into groups and throwing them into places of torment. And it's so it's not a nonviolent book, either testament, but I think it recognizes and addresses that that's part of the nature of our world. We're trying to understand it and figure out how to live with it. And it's something that people a long time ago were struggling with as well, and is an ongoing struggle for us.
So roll right into 16.
Yeah, this one probably generated the most conversation on my Facebook page when I put number 16 up there. Jesus had to die a brutal death to be punished in my place in order for me to escape divine judgment and be saved. This is the so-called penal substitutionary atonement, right?
That's a lot of words to describe that.
But it goes back to, that all the way back to the number 2, right? That we're all horrible and deserve to be tortured forever. And God tortured Jesus in our place. And so now we don't have to suffer that. And I remember distinctly one night in college, so I would have been, my freshman year, 18 years old, thinking about this, and it just didn't make any sense to me anymore. That could be the way that things worked. That God needed to kill somebody. Why did God need to kill somebody? But more seriously, and probably James Cone has helped me think about this more than anybody else in his book, Cross and the Lynching Tree, that I think the lynching is the best way to talk about the death of Jesus. It was an unjust execution, and that doesn't save anybody for that to happen. And so that's it requires, I think, a different way of thinking about that. But part of it is being able to get rid of number 2. Helps me to move away from this one as well. That to think about salvation as liberation, and about the death of Jesus revealing something, not solving a problem by killing one person in place of another one. There again, you get a notion that the way to solve problems is through violence, right? And so I think we've been taking that lesson way too often. So this is another one, or another idea that I think a lot of people are moving away from, because in some ways it relates back to number 18. I'll jump ahead a little bit, but salvation is transactional, right? Jesus paid it all, right? We use all of that transactional language to talk about salvation, and rather than language of liberation and discovery and freedom.
So talk to me a little bit more about that, since nature abhors a vacuum. Talk to me more about liberation and discovery and freedom.
Mm-hmm. I don't find myself needing to say there was any particular reason that Jesus died exactly the way that he did. And probably the thing that bothered me the earliest on about that was thinking, well, if Jesus had to get executed in that way, then weren't the people who were doing it doing God's work, right? And that made no sense to me, right? How does I think the execution, the unjust execution of Jesus, or lynching of Jesus, was a sinful act. How can a sinful act solve the problem of sin, right? And so trying to think about a way to replace that. I do think that that the death of Jesus reveals the way human society tends to work through these systems of domination and transactionalism. And in a sense, Jesus refuses to go along with that, and is lynched because he does. So a way I like to put it is, and this is based partly on my reading of the second chapter of Mark, where Jesus says to the paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, right? And this is right at the beginning of his ministry. He just says so, right? And to say that my sins are not forgiven because Jesus died, but Jesus died because my sins are forgiven, right? That he refused to play a transactional game, and that created conflict, perhaps created the conflict that led to his execution. So it was his saying that the kingdom of God is here, your sins are forgiven, you're free. They killed him for saying that, not so that it could be true. It was already. So I think of it more the other way around, that the forgiveness of sins caused Jesus' death rather than was the result of it.
I like that. I lost track. What number are we on? I think you need to go back and pick up number 17.
We got through 18, but we never got to 17. The central character in every Bible story is a hero and role model I should emulate. I probably first got suspicious of this reading the Samson story. And
yeah, that's who I was thinking of.
there's absolutely nothing admirable about this person, if you read those chapters, and yet we've created this. I mean, it's an attractive story and exciting. He's the Bible's superhero, right? And so everybody, if you like comic books and Marvel movies, here's your guy. But those characters are always kind of mixed in their motives and all of those sorts of things as well, right? And so I needed to learn to stop reading that way, that was the purpose of reading a story. I don't think I put it on here in these words. One of the things I say to students is there's no moral to the story, right? The way we try to reduce a story to a little nugget, right? And the story itself is just packaging. Southern Baptist Sunday school literature used to do this all the time. There was a central truth, right, in every text. And so what we were doing was trying to unwrap it and get to that thing. And I want to let the story be the story, right? Don't try to reduce it to some nice little rule, or here's a character trait of one of the characters that you should try to emulate. But the whole story is a world for me to inhabit and to experience, and a way for me then to think about my own life without trying to reduce it down to be like this or do this, don't do that, right? So there's no moral to the story, because if there's a moral to the story, then the story doesn't matter anymore. Right?
Well, I always think of the book of Judges as the book that really should be retitled to All the Things You Should Never Do. Or all the ways we go wrong, and don't copy any of this. So
it's hard to find maybe Deborah is the best character in that book that we can find. But
okay, so the bishop who ordained me, since we're getting ready to go to number 19, he was known as the Great Commission bishop and wanted our synod to be known as the Great Commission Synod. So you'll have to tell us about 19.
I guess I try to redefine the Great Commission there, because it has become too militaristic. It's about taking over the world, right, and turning the whole world, making the whole world like us. And so I started with that line of, if we can convert the whole world to Christianity, then everything will be good. Well, there are times when whole swaths of the world have been Christian and things did not turn out good. We know that. So maybe we need to think about the Great Commission in some other way, rather than Jesus telling us to go turn the whole world Christian, right? Maybe that's not all that he was saying. So what I proposed on that one was, what if, and I just posed this as a question, what if Jesus' intent when he gave his disciples the Great Commission was not to convert the whole world, but to make sure that his teachings always had a place in the human conversation? So I'm back to that notion of joining into a long conversation, and Jesus has some important ideas to add to that conversation. Our task is perhaps to make sure those are always there, and more than trying to change everybody else to be like me. A phrase that I heard somebody use recently, and I think it originates with Andrew Rawls, who teaches church history at Duke Divinity School, is that Christianity has a serial nature, that it passes through time, changes, evolves, and adapts, rather than that's more important than its spatial nature. That's my term. But rather than taking over the world at any particular time and place, our role is to continue that serial nature of Christianity, to make sure that that the teachings of Jesus always have a place, without needing to rule over everything.
And number 20.
So you can still have the Great Commission. I'm just redefining what it might mean that isn't so that doesn't drive colonialism quite so much.
All right, number 20. Statistics are the measure of our faithfulness.
Well, this one, you grew up Baptist too, and check on the thing on the offering envelope, the six boxes, and we loved to count everything. That's what we did, and we had a whole building downtown here that gathered the stats and published them, and so we were very interested in statistics, and maybe, that's a thing that might have had a good beginning. We want to be able to evaluate things and understand what we're doing, but it really does seem like the stats became the end rather than the means, doesn't it?
Mhm.
And so, the one that I identify here that I hear all the time is, anytime that a church is growing really fast, the assumption is that's the church that has it right, because they're growing really fast. And as it turns out, those churches often crash and collapse, sometimes quickly, sometimes a little bit more slowly. But there are a lot of people that I've encountered that seem to feel badly because their church isn't big and growing fast. When I look at their church, and it seems to me that they're doing what they need to be doing, but they feel like it's not right because their statistics aren't good.
Dang, you just rang my bell on that one too. I sometimes have church low self-esteem, even though because we don't have those big numbers, but yet I do believe that, we are faithful in serving others and faithful to accepting each other and are working really hard to cross different divisions, and not just to hand out things, but to go the next step and form relationships with people
Right.
we are trying to help. So as someone who just finished filling out her parochial reports, which then gets posted on our national website. So if the first thing people, when they want to learn more about Peace can do, they can click on that button and discover these statistics. What should bishops and whatnots be measuring? How do you determine, quote unquote, a healthy community of faith?
I like storytelling,
Don't we all?
and that, I think, it makes a better center of our faith than anything else. Going back to the way we look at the Bible, I don't want to extract the moral. I want to live in the story, and so I would say, tell me your best story from the past year about your church, rather than tell me your average Sunday morning attendance. What's the best story? What's the worst story too? I mean, what was the thing that happened that that troubled you, right? Let's tell stories like that. What was the thing that happened that troubled you, and you're hoping to do something different about? What was the thing that made you joyful or excited or whatever? So figure out a way to say, I want to hear your church's best, and by best I mean perhaps good and bad, but I want to hear your church's best 5 stories from this past year, rather than your average attendance and your average offering and your total membership numbers. Certainly a lot more interesting. Somebody might read those reports and say, good stories in them.
Well, as a pastor, when I tell somebody I'm a pastor, they want to know where my church is. And then almost always the next question is, how many people or how many members do you have at your church?
Yeah.
It never fails.
Yeah.
So, and I just
So
want to
maybe tell me about one of your members that you're really glad is there. Wouldn't that be a better question than how many are there?
Yes. And I do have great stories to tell about folks. They're the amazing things that are happening. So, well, Mark, this has been really, really interesting conversation. And I love how you talked about even some of the ways we do church can be barriers towards forming friendships, and how you talked about a better way of being Christian is to be intentional about forming those relationships. Thanks for being with us today.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.